why we should be socialists, if you want, and then I'm basically going to say because private property. I think private property demands socialism.
Why do you say that?
Because I think do you have a theory of private property at all, or
When you say private property, you're talking capital or personal property?
personal property?
Oh, wait, everybody thinks you should own personal property, right? Even socialists.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to say that personal property comes from an engagement with labor to the world. I think that, like, I would take the Lockean view on private property. So Locke argues that...
Wait, hold on. Just so that my brain doesn't explode, can we be very careful? Because usually when I discuss this with socialists, private property usually explicitly refers to capital. So if you're talking about capital, say like private property. If you're talking about personal property, say personal, just so I can keep that clear in my head, because I've had to go over these definitions so many times. So when you say private property, you're talking personal properody, right?
I'm talking personal property.
Yeah, okay, so, yeah, just so I keep that straight in my head. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I would say that personal property, which I would say is like private ownership, like the individual actually owning that thing and it being theirs for all time. They can do whatever the fuck they want with it, destroy it, like fucking eat it. I don't know, like that's theirs. I would say that comes from engagement with the world. So like if we understand that the world around us is formulated of objects, which implies that they are separate from us.
Okay.
The only thing that can make something private property is if it becomes a product. So I would say that like the production of property or personal property is due to work being done in the world. So you mix your labor in with the object of like nature, like you plow a field, you plant a tree or something, and now that tree is yours because the labor that you've put in essentially made that tree. That tree was the result of your engagement within the world. And that's why private property, like for personal property for John Locke, essentially comes from mixing yourself into reality. So it's yours because you are actually residing in it in some respects. It contains your labor, your property. And that relates to your bodily autonomy, which he sees as given to you by nature.
Wait, holy shit, I gotta ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you think you have a right to lethal self-defense of your property?
Didn't we discuss this? And I said not if you can, not if you can avoid it.
Yeah, but if it's unavoidable, do you have a right to lethal self-defense of your property?
If it's unavoidable,
let's say large guys come into your property, you're a little old, 80-year-old lady, you can't fight them off. You tell them, I'm going to kill you if you keep coming. Do you have a right to defend your property since that's your labor acting on natural resources or capital to create that thing in the world? You're an investment in it, your life force, your labor, energy.
And you can't call the police or anything like that.
They're not going to be there in time, yeah.
They're not going to be there in time. And you can't. Can you claim compensation through the courts?
No.
No. Then yeah, you can kill them.
Fucking based. All right. Okay, keep going.
Okay. So, like, yeah. So I'll just basically say like that's you in the world. So, in which case, I'd say that like when someone hires someone for a wage, that I would relate that to wage slavery. I think you are being rented, because they are no longer purchasing the product of your labor, which would be, your property. They are purchasing you to produce products, which is essentially renting you to produce products from which you never own, which means that you lose the capacity to be a property owner because you're being rented. So whatever you produce is no longer yours, which means you can't engage in free trade because you're not considered capable of owning property. So you're not actually capable of entering a contract. And so what I would say is that it nullifies the logical consistency of the contract because you're both being treated as an object, as property, and as a property owner, and they're incompatible. So I would say that, like in terms of socialism, I'd say that.
Wait, hold on. I gotta fight this in a lot of different ways. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So firstly, don't you consent to entering into some sort of contract for labor? Generally, if we are ignoring like indentured servitude or slavery.
Yeah, I would say that you do consent, but then there's limits to consent, and then there's obviously coercion.
Sure, but any coercive force that exists in a capitalist society is necessarily going to exist in a socialist society, yeah or no?
What necessary force did you say? Sorry.
It's any coercive force that exists in a capitalist society for labor is necessarily going to exist in any socialist or communist society. Do you agree or disagree?
I disagree because you could install. So, for example, if you had something like universal basic income, then you can be free from the coercions of nature, which would force you into.
Wait, hold on. I have to ask: is your socialist society a post-scarcity society where labor is no longer required?
No, I'm not arguing for Star Trek right now.
Okay, so then in your socialist society, you would absolutely need to compel people to work, right? You have to fill jobs, whether it's by a council voting on it, whether it's by people choosing. That coercive force, for your person to live in society, they must work or contribute whatever they can for labor, yeah?
Well, I think that there comes to a point in which we can agree that there would have to be some work done. Yes, and that would be the shared burden of society.
And that shared burden of society would be enforced coercively. You would have to. Like, if you had a person that wasn't following it, the logical end of that is either killing them or kicking them out of society, no?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could say that, like, if you've got someone that won't abide by the rules of society, then they would have to be removed. Yeah,
exactly. I agree. Okay. So I push back a little. When somebody says in capitalism, there's a coercive force enacting you to work, which hampers your ability to consent to that work. But in any socialist or communist society, there would be equally coercive forces because you have to work to make that society work, right? We're not talking about a post-scarcity society where everybody can just dance and do art all day, right?
It's whether it's not just like whether you have to work. It's like whether you can choose to reject a certain contract. And like, so for example, in a socialist society, I would say that your means, you'll be given the means for survival, which allow you to enter the market in a fair and equal way. And so when you see it, like, for example, I've only rejected like one job, and that was because it was the worst job I could have ever like went into. It was like a 0-hour contract. They don't pay you for travel, and they make you travel 6 hours a day. So
I understand real quick before you're going with this, just so I can head you off, and then you can maybe your answers. So I understand everything you're saying, and that perhaps like some sort of social safety net will enable you to reject more contracts, which is less coercive. But my counter to this is going to be that everything you're talking about is not has nothing intrinsic to do with socialism or capitalism. So for instance, we could both right here hypothesize a capitalist society with UBI that is less coercive than a socialist society where everybody has to do forced agriculture, right? And both of those systems could be, one could be capitalism, one could be socialism, but the capitalist one would be far less coercive. And then we could also hypothesize a capitalist society that is incredibly coercive and a socialist society that's not coercive. But the coerciveness of the society, your burden for labor and your choice to do labor, that isn't really intrinsic to the socialist or capitalist aspects of that society, right? It has to do with other things, I would imagine, like distribution of wealth.
Well, I think that the coerciveness of capitalism has to do with essentially the way that profiteering works and the manipulation of trying to maintain a certain level of unemployment. So if you look at something like Friedman economics, that's be like a 3 to 4% unemployment rate. Now, I think you're right that you could have a capitalist society which mediates that problem, like liberalism. Like you could endorse a liberal economy.
Yeah, so I think the unemployment rate is 5%, but that would have to exist in socialism as well, yeah?
No, I don't think so. Like that's essentially one of the arguments that jobs are right.
Wait, okay, I'm not trying to trick or trap you or anything, but I'm just genuinely curious. What is your understanding for why there needs to be an unemployment rate in capitalism?
Usually, like my understanding is it's to balance out the labor market. So like when we talk about like labor as a market, what we've already done is commodified labor. In a socialist society, I would say that when we you wouldn't use labor as a commodity anyway. People only trade the product of their labor and not and are not products themselves to be traded on a market.
Okay, so so that's a tricky answer because you're right, but all you've done is you've eliminated unemployment because you've labeled it something different. Rather than call it unemployment, you're saying there's going to be some workers that aren't currently trading their labor. But it's still unemployment, right? My understanding is more or less what you said, that unemployment exists in a capitalist society because some frictional level of unemployment is necessary because people are going to be changing jobs and moving jobs. Somebody that graduates college might not be working immediately out of college. Somebody might switch from one job to another. We need some level of frictional unemployment to kind of like keep markets moving and labor moving. It's like in a socialist society, for instance, you wouldn't want to live with 0% unemployment because that implies that there are like no other jobs that need to be filled. So if you want to switch jobs, you're fucked. You're like stuck there for your entire life, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, absolutely. I mean, like, but then like that's a separation between, let's say, like forced, deliberately coerced unemployment of 3 to 4%, and like a necessary amount of unemployment for social mobility. Like so, for example, I would say like in Friedman economics, in a very like a neoliberal kind of understanding of economics, unemployment's deliberately kept at a certain rate to enable essentially the profiteering on the labor market.
I think that benefits I mean, I think that benefits a lot of different parties, right? Like it benefits customers that are able to make purchases in markets. I think it can benefit employees that have jobs that they can look for, and then it can benefit employers that also have employees that they can shop from, right? Like I think that I think it's a little bit more three-dimensional than just saying like labor markets are kept artificially low in order to fuck over workers. Like I think that there's like some level of unemployment is probably healthy. Just like there's some level of houses being empty that's probably healthy. You want there to be vacancy for people to move around and whatnot, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, you want to eliminate, like, so for example, like we could agree that like even if there is some like amount of houses that should be empty, we should still eliminate homelessness. We can have empty houses and not have homelessness at the same time. And I think that's kind of that a socialist would approach it. And I think that a socialist and a liberal in terms of redistribution are very similar.
Yeah, I'm just saying like that 5% goal of unemployment in a perfect neoclassical or Keynesian or capitalist model, that 5% unemployment is not people that are unemployed and their lives are fucking ruined and they're falling behind on their house payments. That's just like people that are in between jobs, people that have graduated college, people that are taking a break from the workforce for whatever reason, like that, and people that are seeking work. Like that's like a healthy level of unemployment. Not healthy in that it furthers the capitalist system, but it's like healthy for all market, like all people involved in the market.
Yeah, I would say that I wouldn't even necessarily have a problem with that, except so long as that they maintain a certain level, like standard of living.
Sure.
I think that like that we can have that. Like, so for example, they should be able to re-enter the market and be treated as a fair property owner, and capable of like, you know, endorsing and consenting to a contract in a fair way. And I think that if you have a coercive society that like, I think America is more coercive than somewhere like Scandinavia, for example, because of the healthcare costs. And I think that because you're coerced into working to, you know, in order to pay for certain medical care, you essentially have to, you're willing to do more for less. And I think that because you're willing to put yourself into contracts in which you are not a property owner, I think that is a lot of the time to do with the coercive force and ideology. I don't think people even understand that being an employee is different, how it differs from being, you know, self-employed, or how it differs from being, you know, just an employee, or even like an employer.
Well, even when you're self-employed, like your labor is almost still necessarily being like chipped away at, just in other ways. Like I would argue, like you purchasing products from other people that are part of the supply chain of manufacturing a product is like necessarily like the extraction of your labor in some way to another party, so, unless everybody along your entire supply chain is.
100%, because then you could basically say like what you're saying is like what in terms of exchange, then what we're exchanging is labor, which is like which should be relative to a certain value produced in the world. So if I make like YouTube content and people like the content and they donate to me, then the value of my content's in relation to like the donations I get. And that's not even like, that's fair enough.
Yeah,
and
I'm just saying like if we had like a burger flipper from McDonald's, if they were to set up shop outside and they had to buy the grill from McDonald's and then buy all the product from McDonald's and then buy time in their plate, like, but we say, oh look, this person's not being coerced at all. Like McDonald's isn't taking it. Well, no, he's still losing his profit, just in other ways, right? It's a little bit more hidden that way because they're not directly.
100%.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what you've shown there is that the consumer can be exploited just as much as the worker, which socialists do not talk about, which they very much need to. You don't see too many socialists talking about the exploitation of the consumer, and they usually put consumption as some sort of bourgeois sort of you know, understanding of reality, when in reality consumption is the reason why workers are being exploited in the first place. Because if anything, like the relative prices of food, water, shelter, you know, like medical care and so on, are what we are talking about when we are talking about coercive forces and their access to necessities even, and then obviously you have access to luxuries and you know, other commodities. So I think socialists definitely need to talk about the exploitation of the consumer. And I think that's a really great point. But I guess like what you know, and I was just basically going to say there is that I guess the difference between being someone who is a property owner and entering into a fair relationship in a trade is essentially you own an object, a product, and you trade that to another individual. While someone who exists in, you know, a wage slave relationship in terms of a wage, they are trading themselves and their time and entering into a contract. Yeah. And so they aren't trading anything that I would say that you cannot enslave yourself. And I would say that goes beyond your consent. So would do you agree that you can, or?
I mean, I think that you can make these trades. I think that we can be clever with the way that we label things and try to say that we don't do that in any socialist society. But I think that any sort of society and economic system that you construct is going to necessarily take some buy-in that's going to result in you trading away time in your life for that society to function and for you to exist in that society. And I think fundamentally, I think that's what we're talking about, or at least my interpretation or my impression of what you're saying related to the capitalist framework and why it's immoral is because you have people that are essentially forced to trade away hours of their life or time of their life for somebody else to profit off of for society to function. But I would argue that in every single system that is a society that has people working together, like necessarily there's going to be some type of buy-in like that.
100%. But I think that the difference is like, so in a socialist society, you would be trading. So you would have to put like so many hours in and like labor, like think what Marx talks about, like abstract labor. And you'd have to put so much abstract labor in to essentially produce like whatever it is you're trading. And that's absolutely the case, that when you are entering a trade, then you're trading labor in relation to the value you've produced. But then if you are in a fair trade, then everything that you produce is yours and your property. So the value you produce is always owned by you. And I think that's the difference. If you're an employee, the value you produce is extracted, and then you get paid a proportion of that value back, because you're entering a labor market which is separate to the market of the product you've produced. And I think that's deliberate in order to allow for surplus capital. Okay.
I mean, I can agree with that analysis. I mean, like you're basically giving a Marxian analysis of like extraction of labor, right? Or labor value theory. Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I just don't really think that's a big deal. That's not something that's wrong to me. That's like inconsequential. In terms of like how the economy functions, that's not necessarily what I'm worried about. I think the goal of any economic system should be maximizing its productivity. And then like moral claims are dealt with at the end of that. So like if I've got a socialist society that produces 1 trillion in wealth, and I've got a capitalist society that produces 5 trillion in wealth, I would prefer the capitalist society with heavy redistribution methods than the poor socialist society that's more equitable with its smaller pie, I guess, is what I would say.
Well, I would say that like we can't put ethics, post politics. I think that politics is an ethical endeavor. That is, and in terms of the construction of a state, I would see that as the establishment of a given ethic. So, like when we are talking about,
I agree with you 1,000,000%, but I would say it's more ethical to do the system that maximizes your economic outcome rather than sacrificing your economic outcome for some perceived ethical gain.
John Rawls.
Okay. Is that a Rawlsian thing?
Yeah. You're literally taking the maximum. You're maximizing the minimum outcome. I think that's what it sounds like. You're like essentially, was it justified inequality? He calls it. If a society which is unequal produces more benefit for the lowest classes of individuals, then we can't say that it was less just for the unequal society, because overall it benefits everyone to a greater degree.
Yeah, that guy sounds based. Sad he's dead.
Yeah, he's like king of the liberals.
Oh, fucking awesome! He must be a great guy then.
He's like he's not too bad. John Rawls' Theory of Justice. If you ever want to read like the most liberal book you can ever read, then it's John Rawls.
I love his veil. I hide behind it all the time to make decisions. So seems like a base guy.
Well, that's the thing. I'd say that ultimately he bases it off of very liberal reasoning, and that's Nozick and McIntyre's critique. That essentially he presupposes the outcome based on a certain rationality, which basically concludes that the best society is the one that maximizes the minimum outcome. And that's like, I think that's like a really, like, it's a strong critique. And I think McIntyre shows that, like, it's not surprising, but it's also all of what traditions are going to be biased towards some kind of outcomes because of the way that reason works in rationality and traditions. And so what we need to do is talk about like what is actually best for us, and try and get past the bias if we can, but it's not going to be easy. Now, I think that like that's not entirely that wrong. I think that the issue is that when we talk about maximizing the outcomes of individuals, I think that there's certain metrics I want to talk about as well, not just economic outcomes. I think that a socialist society could produce good economic outcomes anyway. I don't think that it necessitates like economic collapse or anything like that. And then if that's the case, I would say like we can have a more ethical society in which the individual is given more creative control over their lives and autonomy. Then they're capable of I'd say that that's invaluable, and I'd say that it's necessary for you to be a property owner. So like my point was to say really that if we reject the individual's capacity to own property at a given time, if we allow them to consent to a form of slavery, then we reject them as property owners which prevents them from holding property even at a later date, because ultimately they're a form of property, and we've actually commodified a certain class of individuals. Now, and I think that is, and like Vegan Gains try to get us on this. He was like, all right, so if a doctor's earning like 500,000 a year or something, or a lawyer, is he a slave? And I was like, yes, I'll bite the bullet, like 100%, right? Because I think that at the end of the day, it's not about how much money you make. It's about
your relationship to your, that's 100% true. A lot of people, because nobody actually knows anything about what Marx said, and even I barely know what Marx said, but a lot of people seem to think that if you make a lot of money, you're like, you leave the proletariat or whatever, but anybody that has their labor extracted would be considered part of the same class. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It's not about how much capital you've accumulated. It's about your place in the system and like how much control you have over your own life. And like, and look, Marx is a Hegelian, really, in terms of like his tradition. So he relates it to a material contention, which is actually just a master-slave relationship. There is a master and a slave, and if you're the slave, then it doesn't matter how well you paid, you're still the slave. And I think that's essentially what I want to get at, really. But we don't need to I think by treating individuals as a means to an end, rather than an end in themselves, in this idea of them not being a property owner, we've essentially nullified the purpose of the market, which is the exchange of property. And so it no longer becomes a free and fair market, and so has entered into a form of servitude. And if that's the case, then the market outcomes, ultimately, even if they are economically better for the lower classes, those individuals can't be benefiting from them because they are in a place of, it's like, I would say that it's not that you, even if you're a well-treated slave, you should still not want to be a slave, and that it's irrational to want to be a slave.
Yeah, this is, I don't think I agree with these precepts. I just don't think I agree with that. I think that if we could choose between two systems, one where there's some overlord that's like some benevolent overlord of us, and we're slaves on some property, and we have to work for 8 hours a day to live under the blah, 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 versus us being like truly free, struggling for survival in the wilderness where we don't have access to medicine or clothes or property. Like, I think I would rather be under the benevolent slave dictatorship or whatever.
I mean, like, that's fair enough. I mean, but then you can say like you were coerced into it, right? But if you could have two societies, one which would maximize freedom and one which would maximize, economic outcome, but both of them manage to essentially not only maintain an adequate level of survival, but provide luxuries and access to like
I mean, if the level of like luxury and the level of like output and everything was similar between a capitalist and socialist society seems way cooler. Seems like it would be nicer to sort things out economically rather than requiring like government policy to fix it all up at the end. But now our problems root back. We're leaving philosophy now, and now we're going to like empirical economic claims, where I just haven't seen that work. Because if it did work, that would be awesome. We don't actually even need to do taxes or UBI or anything. Like every citizen would be bought into like the means of their production, so all of those profits would be distributed to people, and then everybody would be fine. You wouldn't need to redistribute anything.
That's exactly right. You might as well be taking the words out of my mouth. And I think this is, funnily enough, the criticism that Robert Nozick makes of Rawls, in terms of why he wants redistribution, because he's like, look, why are you trying to fix redistribution? Why don't you fix distribution first?
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons that we have such unfair distribution is built into the system in which we treat labor as a market and try to extract as much profit from it. And I think that ultimately it's one, I think it leads to like political instability, because I think that the system that we have now accumulates wealth to such a high level that we're ending up in situations where markets are becoming unstable, people have too much control, and things like that. And then we're having to rely upon the government extracting that labor back, that value back, and then distributing amongst the people in some sort of Keynesian or even Friedman economic way, like, with the debt jubilee. And I think that's what's happened with Corona. I think that's kind of what happened with the banks, except they gave it directly to the debtors, which didn't work. And this is what continues to happen, and try to mediate the political instability capitalism causes.
Yeah, I understand everything. So just to be clear, everything you're about to say, I'm probably going to agree with on a theoretical level. But the problem is that we have to run this back now. I don't want to say epistemically. That's not. Empirically. Because if it turns out to be the case, because I think we even agree with each other here. If it turns out to be the case that every time a socialism or a socialist society is attempted, it ends in just abject failure and destruction, even without external influence, then I think we would both agree, well, okay, a socialist society doesn't really serve the end we're looking for. Even if it is more free, it's probably shit. And then on the flip side, if a socialist society achieved about the same ends as a capitalist one, or even economic, even if it was like a little bit worse, I would probably still prefer the socialist society heavily. It just grounds back in empirical claims rather than philosophical ones. Because for me, like, and actually even Marx, I don't believe felt that when Marx spoke of the exploitation of labor, he didn't morally load that claim. That was just like a descriptive thing. He didn't say exploitation, I don't think, was necessarily immoral or wrong, right?
Well, he didn't, but then it's kind of implied, like in terms of the alienation of the worker. Like,
sure, when you get into that, I get it, yeah. But I'm just saying, like, for me, like even if there is some level of exploitation occurring there, where value is being extracted, I don't really care that much, as long as the end product of like being in a society where everybody's taking care of everything is probably better. Because we can probably agree that even in a society where value is being extracted from labor, there definitely exists a spectrum of people that feel very alienated from their labor versus people that have really positive engagement with their labor, even if there's a capitalist extracting value from them, right?
Oh, dumb. Yeah, well, I think... sorry to someone in chat. I just accidentally timed out the wrong person. Oh my god, I'm really sorry.
Oh shit!
I've just seized the means of that production. I've just bourgeois them to death. But yeah, like
like a lawyer. Yeah, or maybe
like,
not a lawyer, but like a musician that like his profit is being taken by the record labels, etc. That musician probably enjoys his labor more than like maybe like a blue collar worker that wanted to go to college or something, right? Like even though he's still being exploited, there's something.
Like, if you even look at musicians, like look, like there's so many musicians that are exploited as shit. They're rich as fuck, but it doesn't matter because like they don't get control over their lives, and I think that's awful. And I think that's an issue. Like they're forced to write albums when they feel like they can't, so then they're producing like shit.
It can definitely happen, but then we also have like today, like there's like a greater variety of music, although the capitalization of music has led to the mainstream being like very hollow, or very narrow, I should say. But like there's still like a lot of like crazy new innovative music being produced all over the place as well, though, right?
True.
Whereas like if we were all like ultra free in a forest playing the Hunger Games all day, like not to say that socialism would necessarily turn other way.
No, yeah, no, I definitely don't want that.
I fight back against this argument the same way that I fight back against like libertarians or ANCAPs. Like I don't think freedom in and of itself is necessarily a good thing. In fact, there are plenty of times when servitude is not only justified but like morally demanded of us. Like my kid should it be a form of servant to me, right? Like I have autonomous control over my child. I direct him, I force him to go into school slavery, and then at home he might go into chore slavery, and then until he grows up, like he might be essentially like a slave to the parents in ways. But like violation of autonomy for a greater end isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Taxes aren't necessarily a bad thing, or maybe forced like community services.
I agree, but then I would say like there is a difference between like I don't think that you're necessarily violating their autonomy, because I would say that the autonomy comes from rational decision making and self-determination. So if you're doing something rational, so if like for example, if an individual engages in, let's say, a restriction of their freedom in something like abiding by the law, I don't think that's actually restricting that freedom. I think that's actually maximizing that freedom, because it may look as if it's restricting that freedom in a positive sense. They're not allowed to murder people, but overall, we all agree that murder is wrong. Yeah, and so we can produce a society that actually maximizes like the minimizes the chance that someone's going to trespass upon your subjectivity, and so you're actually maximizing your freedom.
Yeah, I agree 1,000,000%. But like everything you said there, I would just apply that to capitalism, right? By entering into a contract where you are combining your labor with somebody else's capital and you're allowing them to extract some value off of you, the money that you're generating after that is going to be greater than if you were living in a forest with absolute freedom somewhere. So in that sense, you are sacrificing some level of autonomy for like a greater end.
I guess there is two things I think I would want to say there. One, I think that would have to presuppose like the outcome of the society will be economically so bad that it prevents an individual from being a property owner in themselves. So the market would be destroyed. So like if you say like, look, if we went this route where people like actually were property owners, the market would be destroyed. So we can only allow for so much private property. That would be, I suppose, a fair argument. But then even how we, decide who is the property owner and how that system works, then we'll probably enter a form of liberalism. But I don't think I haven't seen an argument that's been like substantive that shows that socialism will always fail. And
well, you can never prove that, right?
Well, maybe not. But I think you could prove like thank you. I think we could prove that at least to some degree that the economic system would be more unstable or something like that, or and maybe even if we had like some
I think
social
that
experiment.
macro level stuff like that is going to be impossible to prove, right? Like that, like there might, like, you couldn't prove that Nazism will always fail, right? Like that's just impossible. You can't run experiments like that on a grand level so much. And I think that's a little bit dangerous. Like we can't, the proof, the burden is really on the person presenting the new idea to push for kind of like slow or gradual adoption and then less friction into moving into that idea, rather than just presenting the argument like, well, you know, maybe it won't always fail. Like, let's radically redesign. And this is the problem that I run into with so many social, do you know who Ben Burgess is?
I don't.
Okay. You're not missing anything. But this is the problem I run into with so many socialists, is that it feels like towards the end of the conversation, because like socialism sounds really cool. The idea that you are bought in and you own a part of whatever property you're working, and then like when that does well, you do well. The idea that like that just the concept of that ownership sounds really cool, because you're not just like having some faceless boss. Like everybody that you're working alongside is all bought into that. That sounds like a cool idea, but if that hasn't been shown to produce better outcomes, everybody seems to have this answer that like, well, the only way it'll work is if the entire world switches overnight. Because if it happens in just one neighborhood, then banks will crush it. You know, if it happens in just one city, you know, the state will crush it. You know, if it happens across a state, you know, the rest of the country or the federal government will crush it. And if it happens in just one country, another capitalist country will crush it. So it seems to be that like socialism
does actually seem to happen, like, unfortunately. Every time
you
it does
say
pop
that,
up, like,
but I mean, like, there's been fighting back and forth. If capitalism is the more tenacious system, then I mean, like, that seems to be an argument in favor of its survival.
It's not even about tenacity. It's like, it's about the plutocracy of our society. So we've already got like vested interests in capitalism, and we've already got like people who have accumulated a lot of power. So like, if it's something that like, it's like kind of like, it's like the rebels in Star Wars. It's like if they had have been found by the Empire straight away and everyone knew where they were, they would have just got fucking annihilated.
Yeah, but you don't think those economic forces might have had anything to do with the way that those societies turned out? Like, I'm curious, actually. We can't prove this.
No, like if you look at Russia, right? Like the USSR, shit, horrible society, atrocious. They should never be done. And I wouldn't even say like socialist in terms of ethics, because I think like the vanguardism is fundamentally unequal and produces a class-based society. So like it's fucking dumb. But you know, tankies, whatever. Like the reality is that they did manage to take a absolutely fucked economy from World War One, you know, produce a system which managed to take a, you know, newly industrializing, backward agricultural nation to this arguably the second most powerful nation in the world. So like there has to be, like, in terms of, I wouldn't recommend that kind of society, but clearly there are other modes of production or other means of accumulating like wealth and power that are as at least as capable as capitalism.
Yeah, but the problem with that analysis, and I understand that, but the problem with this analysis is that it shoulders all the benefits of that society moving forward onto the backs of like saying that it was a movement towards socialism, which I said, well, at least it did something good, but it could have just as easily been the idea of industrialization that moved in that direction. It is entirely conceivable that the USSR as a capitalist society would have made even more progress, right?
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's what we do with capitalism as well. I think that we justify capitalism as producing all these great things. In reality, what's produced these great things is human innovation. I think that capitalism just so happens to coincide with the progression of like ideology. So
yeah, but it seems like when we look at like innovation, doesn't it feel like that comes more from capitalist mindsets anyway? Like even if we move away from just like creating capital, even when it comes to things like art, isn't that something that is like historically kind of like repressed in big socialist regimes? If we say the USSR was idealistically socialist, or MLs, right? If we say that China was idealistically socialist, don't they even suppress things like the creation of art?
Idealistically socialist, I really don't think
well, the reason why I say idealistically is they claim to be moving in that direction, right? You need a strong capital foundation. Even Marx would say you need a strong capital foundation in order to move there, right? So the Vanguard Party guides them into that era of socialism, right?
Self-justifying bullshit, as to be entirely honest with you. And I think that they ultimately serve their own ends. And I think that's kind of like, this is the lack of like moralism that is in the left. And it seems like, you know, people like Hakim, you know, Vosh sometimes justifies revolution, and they don't realize that when they justify like the vanguard production of like morals and the destruction of our institutions, all we end up doing is destroying the very reasons we're revolted, put in like some sort of a very similar state with people who run it in a very similar way, and usually we're backtracking to some sort of fascism. And I think Slavoj Žižek makes that critique like all the fucking time. Like the failure of the left is like fascism. And I think that's like genuine risk. And I think that's what happened in the USSR. I think that's what's happened in China. And it's something that I think we really need to avoid, to be entirely honest with you. And I wouldn't consider them socialists in terms of ethics. But then I'm a libertarian socialist, so I think they're fucking crazy.
Sure. Okay. But then, I mean, then that just kind of hurts us even more then, because it's like we have no baseline to use for socialist values. We're just kind of like out here like with a really cool theory. But
thing happened with capitalism. That same thing happened with capitalism when that was coming around. And the reason that capitalism moved, when we moved into capitalism, was ethical reasons. Like we moved from like feudal, like the feudalistic monarchy states, industrialized into capitalism, was partly because of the rejection of the bloodiness and authoritarianness of the king, which allowed us to become more individualistic. And then individualism and capitalism sort of like fed into each other, and so the aristocracy became more empowered, and the system, the justice system started changing around it, and then we started having like more and more parliamentary control, which then coincided with obviously the increasing power of the aristocrats, and then eventually it ends up becoming like a what we have now, unfortunately, like an oligarchy. I would argue pretty much.
Yeah, sure. I guess at the end of the day, like if somebody has like some small policy positions that kind of like move us in a particular direction, then that would be fine. But I don't have any yet, so.
£5.
Sorry.
Q. If I was an act utilitarian, should it be more ethical if it ought to form a worker-owned co-op?
Delete that. Right, I had to do that last time as well. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you for the donation, though. Yeah, like essentially, like I guess the issue I have is if we can like make reforms towards a socialist state, then we can accept that socialism is more ethical and it's what we should try to get to.
As long as it continues to produce like similar economic outcomes as capitalism, yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's agreed. But then we can be socialists and be reformists, and in which case that's fine. And I completely agree. Sure. Reform, not revolution. And in which case, like then like you can call yourself a socialist and say like, look, I do agree with socialism. I just think that we need to go through a stage of like reform and development, which may entail a level of liberalism. And ultimately, I agree with the ideology. I just fundamentally don't see we're getting there right now.
Sure.
And that then you're a socialist. You're just like, right, but there's material limitations, and we can't do what Lenin and Trotsky in that thought, and just skip like levels of ideological like development. And I think that's exactly what we've happened to come to the conclusions with. Like, look, right now everyone's so fucking capitalist. If you just went and had a revolution, they would make another capitalist society. They wouldn't even know how to be socialist. Like, do you think that the average everyday individual is capable of being like a leader in terms of like?
Well, I got so much shit for this before. Actually, people roasted the fuck out of me, but I kind of made a joke about that on Twitter and people say that I believe in like manager brains or worker brains, but there is like some level of understanding that goes into running a company, and I wouldn't want to put like, depending on the type of company I work, I wouldn't want to put our policies up to a vote. Like if I worked at a nuclear power plant, I don't know if I would want to put our policies up to a vote where like janitors or people are voting on like, how we should contain our reactions. Like that's kind of a scary thing. And people like made fun of me like, oh, you think that the manager brain is so special? I was like, well, no, but like specialization in labor, some people do know more than others about certain things.
Well, I think that actually managers are, funnily enough, I think counter to that position. Like I wouldn't go and ask the managers, I'd go ask the nuclear scientists. And I think that this is like, what do they talk about? Like techne in ancient Greece. So like, even though they had direct democracy, like who had control and had sway in the vote was dependent upon the techne, the skill of the individual who was making the position. So like if you stand up, and you argue for your position. Like, I'm a nuclear scientist, right? We definitely do not want to shield this with plastic, and that's who you should listen to. In terms of managerial science, I think that most of the time managers are rhetoricians. I think that the descendants of rhetoricians who argue that they can make people more efficient, and that the hands of the CEO class in order to essentially create essentially extract as much profit from each department as possible. And so when we talk about decision-making processes, like I think rhetoricians ultimately hinder the decision-making process. They don't enhance it. And so when you talk about like, who should be making the vote, like I think that democratizing the workplace would be beneficial to the workplace in many ways. And I think the Adenauer government in West Germany kind of showed that. Like they gave, the workers a seat on the board, and they saw profits increase because workers understand the process a lot better than the managerial class.
Sure. Okay.
And then in which case, then why don't we, like, I do agree that, like, right now, people are not capable of running businesses or are not capable of self-employment for the most part. And a lot of that comes from, like, a lack of maturity, right? And I think that, to quote Kant, he says that, like, freedom is the prerequisite for the maturity for freedom. And I think that at the end of the day, we're going to have to slowly introduce, like, the lower classes into more responsibility so that they can be capable of the responsibility of being self-directed. But, like, keeping them in, like, a childlike state is ultimately harming them, and it's harming, like, the overall market, because we've got a bunch of workers who don't understand, like, why they're working. They have no investment in the business, and they ultimately don't care about the market outcomes.
Okay, sure. I don't think we necessarily disagree. I think it all just comes down to the like the empirical claim. So there's not much room here for, because, like, yeah, if socialism worked 100% perfectly well in the real world, like, I don't think I would have a problem with it. I'm not, like, married to capitalism, like, morally. Like, that's just a means to an end for me, I guess.
So would you say that morally, like, at least in theory, not necessarily in practice, because we don't have, as you say, we don't have the information, that socialism's more moral?
No, not necessarily. I would say it all depends on, like, the outcome that we're looking at, on whether or not we're achieving that outcome or not. And if we are, then that whatever system.
But then in principle, like, so, like, what I was saying is, like, in practice, like, socialism mightn't be, because if, like, let's say it's more moral in, like, reasons, but then, you know, fails to, like, produce any outcome, then it's not, you know, efficient in practice. But in principle, like, the perpetuation of, like, autonomy.
No, because I don't have, like, any intrinsic attachment to autonomy, and in some ways I even kind of reject it, because I feel like in order to have, like, a functioning society, there has to be some buy-in, some obligation of, like, an average citizen in order for it to work, which kind of necessarily, like, overrides autonomy, I think.
I don't think so, because I think, like, if it's rational engagement, like, understanding that, like, you have needs and that they need to be met, and you are being moved by nature, isn't a rejection of your autonomy. It's an expression of your freedom when you're abiding by reason.
Well, sure, but, like, you have to understand the way that you're defining that. I'm going to flip around that same definition and use it for everything that I say as well, right? Well, in actuality, engaging with somebody in a capitalistic mode as labor isn't a rejection of your freedom. It's actually an embracing of your freedom, because it enables you to do more things, right? I'm going to say the exact same thing.
Well, I would say, like, in terms of, like, like, you would be right if you could show that it was necessitated, empirically.
Yeah, and the necessitation comes from our empirical disagreement. Like, if there existed a system like socialism somewhere that was working, so, like, here's something that I would say. I would say that the way that we engage with healthcare in the United States, I would say that's unethical, because it seems to be demonstrated in other countries that there are other ways to run this in ways that don't sacrifice any economic output at all, and it makes no sense why we wouldn't, like, be moving in that direction. I would say that.
Well, yeah, and well, what about markets, right? Why is it that, like, why, let's say, like, a socialist market wouldn't be successful if it's, like, full of worker cooperatives? Like, why is it that that wouldn't be necessarily, like, capable of competing when we see that, like, outcomes in certain businesses have increased by worker participation? That like,
I don't think we actually. That's the problem. I don't think we actually see that.
Oh no, we have. Like, I think so. Like, from what I've seen, like, small tech companies, for example, like, obviously very niche cases.
Well, yeah, because I was going to say there might be, like, very small scale cases, but in terms of, can you run an entire economy like that? Like, if you have a case of, like, highly trained engineers that are working with equal ownership of a company, that's far different than, like, could Walmart run as a co-op, right? I don't think that's a fair comparison.
Well, I think that, like, it depends on how they run as well, and then you can have, like, so you can still have hierarchy. You can have justified hierarchy, and Marx was all about that, and he thought that was fine. And I think that's essentially the way that would have to take it. Like, the people who are, like, making the decisions are elected democratically by people who, you know, they're like, look, this guy's given good reasons, and he seems to know what he's talking about, so he's our political representative in the business. And so you get, like, a managerial class, like, not a managerial class, you get a class of individuals who are, you know, decision makers, who are democratically held in their positions. But the thing is that we never get a chance to even implement any of these policies. And I guess the main argument that I'm making, I think that right now the capitalist system is stifling any political change. Like, we're not getting a chance to reform.
Yeah, I agree. Real quick, I agree. I'm going to agree with everything you're saying. It just all rests back to some empirical claim, right?
But then we need to try it. Like, at the end of the day, like,
but the question is, how do we try it?
Well, this is the thing. Like, we could like political experiments, like social experiments, in terms of, if we agree that we're not going to destabilize, you know, like, and we'll put in like protections for a certain area.
Yep, and I agree. Again, I'm going to agree with all of this before getting ahead of that. I would even actually, because it's a new idea, I would be in favor of even incentivizing that. That maybe there's preferential loans given to people that want to start like co-ops or something like that. That would be a cool idea.
That's the kind of thing that I would think that we should be engaging.
Yeah, of course, like, 100%. But I don't disagree with any of that at all. 1,000,000%. Yeah.
Then you're like, I don't think that you're necessarily even a liberal if you're saying that, like, look, I think that like this is better.
I mean, like, I'm a liberal, and so I like, I'm not married to liberalism or socialism. Those are like downstream positions from, like, I guess, my moral beliefs, and that, like, we should enable as many people as possible to live their lives as maximally as possible. So like socialism or capitalism is downstream from that. If you can demonstrate one being superior to the other, well, then I'll abandon the whatever instantly. I don't care. I don't have any moral attachment to capitalism at all.
Right. So like, it's genuinely, so like, would you not be in favor of trying to move to socialism then through reform, like as in like incentivizing, let's say, worker ownership, and then just seeing how it economically turns out, like one step at a time, not try and force a whole new economy, but like, you know, just implement certain socialist policies, like one at a time, and see if they work out.
Yeah, always. Everybody should be in favor of that. 1,000,000%. Yeah. It just seems to be the case that we don't really have any empirical evidence yet that shows that, like, co-ops or that form of organization is, like, superior. And then also, to be clear as well, even if society was completely full of co-ops, that doesn't eliminate capital markets necessarily. Like, that could be a different thing as well. Unless you're saying, like, co-ops can't raise external investment, or you would, like, that would be, like, more complicated. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be against that at all. I don't think, arguably, I don't think any capitalist would be against that. They shouldn't be, unless they have some very weird, I don't even know what would be wrong with it, but like, if you could demonstrate to any capitalist leaning person, like, hey, look, like, co-ops are incredibly positive, any capitalist person would be like, yeah, sure, 100%, we should try this out for sure. It increases more product.
Probably right, and that's why I was basically taking the argument for property. But I think that the difference between capitalism and socialism is like if you're a capitalist in the sense that you want to maximize private property, like you know, like you're like Adam Smith or you know, you're John Locke, then yeah, I think that you'll probably want to move towards socialism if you could. Because you'd be like, wow, this is fucking better. Like, market socialism is better for maximizing for the production of capital. It's maximizing private property ownership. This is just overall, like, essentially.
Yeah, again, you keep running to this area, and I'm not going to disagree with you, but these claims come after empirical ones. That's the problem. The
issue is that like, and I would agree. I think that's 100% the case. I think that the issue is that whether people like are actually approaching, like, if we all agree that socialism is correct in terms of ethics, but then in terms of pragmatics.
Yeah, but I don't agree with that. I don't care about the ethics of a person's relationship to their labor. That's not something that I'm innately concerned with. And I would argue most people aren't, because I think even in this conversation, you've agreed that if a better relationship with your labor means that you're doing forced agricultural day, then who cares, right?
I think they are. I think they are very much engaged in, because I think when you are alienated, I think Marx gives a good, like, psychological account almost of why alienation's bad for the individual. So, like, I think that ultimately, like, if you look at, like, the way that, like, take somewhere like Japan, like, the way in which...
Wait, real quick, just before we go, because I agree with you that being alienated from your labor is bad. I just don't know if that's necessarily intrinsic to capitalism, and I don't know if that's necessarily avoidable in socialism. That's what I'm saying.
You see, I think that if we separate capitalism and socialism with worker ownership, then alienation would be a necessitated part of capitalism.
I totally disagree. I think that it is. So, for instance, it would be possible to run. It would be like, I think these ideas can be completely divorced. So, for instance, I think in a capitalist, like, job, you could theoretically, like, pull your employees for ways that you want to change how you organize or how you do, like, a particular aspect of your job. And then also we could envision in a socialist society, because I've heard 50 million different ways for how you organize these socialist societies. If we take, like, a Michael Albert participatory economics approach, right, where we're shuffling people around different jobs all the time, even if you have ultimate control over your job, you might still feel incredibly alienated from your labor because you don't feel like you're getting the kind of control that you want because you're shuffled around to so many jobs all the time, right? Now, I'm just saying that, like, I don't think that alienation of your labor is necessarily baked in to capitalism in the worst way possible and is necessarily alleviated in all socialist systems in the best way possible. I think that it still comes down to, like, the economic forces at work in both systems and like the actual, like, scarcity or not scarcity of products or whatever they have available. Yeah,
you're actually right in many ways, and I think what you did show there is that there are benefits to capitalism in terms of, like, what capitalism is allowed for, which is, I think, social mobility and control of one's life to some degree, like the idea of a market does anyway. And I think that's why market socialism is so much more advantageous than something like authoritarian socialism or something like that, where people aren't given, like, directed control of their lives. The whole point of rejecting alienation was to, like, basically maximize the freedom of the individual, so that And in which case,
I agree. I agree with you there. I'm not trying to cut you off. I just want to make sure because most of what you're saying, I'm agreeing with. I think, and most of what I'm saying, I think you're agreeing with it. At the end of the day, these are just going to rest on empirical claims. My issue with market socialism, I don't know how far you're going to do it. Market socialism sounds kind of like a cool idea, but I have no fucking idea how in practice it actually works. Because some people talk about market socialism like it's literally just capitalism with a ton of co-ops, which doesn't seem to be like anything related to socialism at all. It sounds like an interesting idea, but
well, I would probably say that there needs to be a certain level of a mixed economy. So like you would have to have like, I would say like, and I would argue even from a right wing position, if you take something like Robert Nozick's principle of compensation, where he basically says if you trespass upon another's like property and subjectivity, then you need to compensate them for that. And the most efficient way to do that in terms of justice, he argues, is in the production of a central justice system, which provides people with lawyers and stuff. So he's like, look, if like at the end of the day, you're going to have people have representation. So we're going to have to do this. The most efficient way to do this is through like centralized justice and not through a private system. So create a public system since it's necessitated anyway. And I think that like that's essentially what I would say in terms of like universal basic income, access to food, water, and shelter. Look, the market is dependent upon individuals' involvement. The maximization of the market's outcomes are dependent upon the education and capability of the workforce.
Yeah, so I understand everything you're saying, but like just real quick, like every economy is mixed to some extent, right? Like everybody argues for a mixed economy except for like fucking ANCAPs or hardcore communist, right? Yeah. But like, so like here's like a question, like, and I'm so curious what the answer is going to be. Okay, I consider this to be pretty basic. Because like in market socialism, how do you decide what job you want to do? And what do you do, more importantly, if we're short on a certain type of job?
I think if you're short on a certain type of job, then the market ultimately, I think we've shown like if it was left to the market forces, like natural market forces, supply and demand would usually incentivize that job.
Yeah, so I agree with you there. But then are you really moving that far away from capitalism when you're still relying on like wages and higher wages for more skilled jobs and all of that?
Not like wages, though. I think that's the separation.
What's the incentivization if not wages?
Sorry?
How do you incentivize different labor markets without wages?
It's more of like you can have people that get more money for the value they produce. So like for the product of the labor would be more valuable. And so like they wouldn't be paid a wage. So there wouldn't be like the extraction of surplus. I was just making that real difference. Like there wouldn't be an employee-employer relationship.
Okay, but at the end of the day, it would still be more like money for those people then. Just you wouldn't call it wages.
Yeah, and I have no problem with that. The value of your labor is worth more. It's probably maybe it's a shit job and no one wants to work it. So when you're doing it, like let's say you're a bin man and like bin men are sought after. So like you get paid more. That's absolutely cool. You deserve it. Well, I
guess at the end of the day, then it feels like you're getting into a very similar arrangement in a capitalist system then, where you have like
it's like capitalism plus. That's the way I like to think of like market socialism. It's like capitalism if it was done right. Like,
wait, hold on 1 second. I gotta mute for 1 second. Socialism doesn't say everyone makes the same. What is this question, Destiny? So Dance Chameleon, okay? I don't know why. I've got a lot of letters in my chat right now, okay? Please stop trying to shoehorn every single person down some stupid fucking argument tree that you've read and made fun of with your dipshit lefty white suburban friends a million times in your dumbass fucking Twitter groups. I'm not saying that in a socialist system everybody ought to make the same wages, okay? What I was implying is that if you're making massively different wages in a market socialist system, it seems like the conditions that those people would live in would also be quite different. Inequality would be very high. One of the biggest arguments given in favor of socialism is it would alleviate things like inequality in society. So for instance, like the inequality between classes, okay? Please stop trying to just run everything I say down. You're perma-banned. I'm just explaining to you why you're a fucking moron. Nothing is more fucking obnoxious than you dipshit white fucking socialists that come in here and you start spamming like argument trees like, oh, you don't think blah, blah. No, I never said that. Like, you're so desperate. You're so unbelievably fucking desperate for somebody to say one trigger word and you're like, I've heard this argument on Twitter before, and then run them down that. If you can't engage with the conversation, go to somebody else's chat, okay? Holy fuck, please fuck off. You're so fucking stupid.
Stream guy.
Sorry, I had to sneeze. Okay, what's up?
Man. Hey, man.
Yeah, I don't think. Okay, yeah, I don't think we necessarily disagree on anything. It just comes to be what comes to be shown to work at the end of the day. Best is where best is like maximizing the minimal position, I guess. Yeah.
So like, I guess what I would say like to that is then what you could say is like, I'm a socialist in principle, but I'm a liberal in pragmatism. And until I'm shown otherwise, then I don't know what to do, And I think that's like a fair position to take. And that's just like for example, I don't think there's a reason that we couldn't make at least this economy more meritocratic, even under capitalism. I think that less coercive, allowing it to be like even in terms of liberalism, and in terms of a mixed economy. And I think we can, and I think you're right, and like showing at least what works in terms of like why don't you advocate for a universal healthcare system in the United States? That kind of thing. It's like,
or why not have like better public transportation, so monopsony doesn't exist so much on corporate power, where you have to work a certain job because you can't even go to another part of the city. Yeah, I don't disagree with these things at all, of course.
Yeah, and then obviously, like, it's the same thing with education and stuff like that. And I think liberals and socialists agree on like a shit ton of stuff in terms of like what we necessarily need to provide people. I think that the only difference the real point of disagreement is whether people should be allowed to own the product of their labor in terms of whether wages should exist or not. And I think that wages are a fundamentally incoherent idea. I think that it's irrational and ultimately perpetuates an unethical society if it can be avoided. And I think that's something that like where we disagree on terms of whether it's pragmatic or not. Because like if we agree that if it could be avoided, I think you would also agree then we probably should avoid it if it would produce decent economic outcomes.
Okay, sure. I don't necessarily disagree. All right. Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
Why aren't you vegan yet, man?